The rain didn't so much fall on Redemption's Bluff as it did try to drown it. It turned the single, wide street into a river of thick, brown sludge that sucked at the boots of any soul unfortunate enough to be crossing it. It drummed a relentless, miserable tattoo on the warped shingles of the saloon, a place grandly and ironically named The Last Hope. Inside, the air was a foul cocktail of wet wool, stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and the bitter smoke from tallow candles that sputtered against the gloom. The laughter was the worst part. It wasn't the sound of joy or camaraderie. It was a coarse, jagged thing, clawing at the smoky air. It came from a knot of men clustered around the main table, their faces flushed with drink and casual cruelty, their eyes fixed on the spectacle at the center of their circle. There stood Alara. She was 17, though the fear etched on her face made her look both younger and anciently weary. Her dress, a simple calico of faded blue, was torn at the shoulder, and a smear of mud stained her cheek where she'd stumbled being dragged inside. She kept her chin high, a desperate, fragile act of defiance, but she couldn't stop the trembling in her hands, which she had clasped so tightly her knuckles were bone white. Her gaze was fixed on a dark, sticky spot on the floorboards, refusing to meet the leering eyes that devoured her. "Look at her, boys," a voice boomed, thick and greasy as the bacon fat congealing on a nearby plate. "Fresh as a spring daisy, ain't she? Never seen a day of hard labor and never known a man. Pure as the driven snow before it gets trampled into mud." The speaker was Silas Croft, a man whose ambition had far outstripped his morals. He had a round, soft belly that strained the buttons of his vest and a smile that never reached his small, piggish eyes. He held up a bottle of amber liquid, letting it catch the flickering lamplight. "And all it'll cost one of you lucky gents is a bit of whiskey, a small price for a lifetime of companionship." Another wave of coarse laughter washed over the room. In a dark corner, hunched over a table, a thin man in threadbare clothes flinched. Thomas, Alara's father, drained his mug, the cheap liquor doing little to burn away the shame that was eating him alive. He had lost his last dollar, his last acre, and finally, his last shred of dignity. Silas had offered him a way out of his debt. 10 cases of whiskey, enough to keep him numb for a year, in exchange for the one pure thing he had left in the world. He couldn't look at his daughter. He couldn't bear to see the betrayal in her eyes. "I've got an opening bid," a grizzled trapper with a matted beard shouted, slamming 5 bottles onto the table. "5 bottles of your finest rotgut, Silas." "5. Is that all?" Silas scoffed, his gaze sweeping the room. "For a girl like this, look at that hair like spun gold. Those eyes, the color of a summer sky. You're insulting the merchandise, Jedediah. I need 20 bottles to even start this conversation properly." He reached out and grabbed a lock of Alara's blonde hair, yanking her head back. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. She finally looked up, her blue eyes flashing with a mixture of terror and white-hot fury. She met Silas's gaze for a heartbeat, and for a moment, he saw something other than a frightened girl. He saw a cornered animal, and it made his grin widen. "Spirit," he chuckled, releasing her hair. "I like that. It'll make breaking her all the more satisfying for the lucky winner." A ranch hand, emboldened by drink, shoved forward a crate. "There's 12 in there, Silas. That's my bid." The bidding escalated, a grotesque auction where a human life was bartered for cheap liquor. The men became more boisterous, their comments more vulgar. They weren't just bidding on a person, they were reveling in the power they held over her, in the degradation of it all. To Alara, their voices blurred into a monstrous drone, a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She felt a single, hot tear trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of rage. Rage at her father's weakness, at Silas's greed, and at the world that allowed this to happen. 15 bottles and a silver dollar, another man bellowed, throwing a coin that skittered across the table. Silas's eyes gleamed as he snatched it up. 15 it is, going once a fine price for such a prize, he roared, his voice slick with triumph. He looked around the room, savoring his victory, his power. Going twice, sold, to the man with the silver. His words were cut short by a sudden, violent sound. The batwing doors of the saloon didn't swing open. They were thrown, slamming against the interior walls with a crack that silenced the room instantly. Laughter died in throats. Smirks froze and faded. Every man turned toward the entrance. Framed in the dark doorway was the silhouette of a man. The relentless rain served as a backdrop, making him seem like an apparition conjured from the storm itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but it was the stillness about him that commanded attention. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, letting the silence he had created stretch and deepen until it was more unnerving than the loudest noise. The light from inside was weak, but it caught the glint of rainwater on the brim of his low-slung hat and the worn, dark leather of his duster. He took one slow step into the room, and then another. His boots made a soft, squelching sound on the muddy floorboards, the only sound in the now tomb-like saloon. The doors swung shut behind him, plunging the room back into its dim, flickering light. His face was shadowed by his hat, but no one needed to see his expression. His presence was enough. His gaze, cold and deliberate, swept across the room. It moved from one stunned face to the next, a silent accounting. It passed over the trapper, the ranch hand, and the others, who suddenly seemed very interested in their drinks or the patterns in the wooden tables. His eyes lingered for a second on the slumped, pathetic form of Thomas in the corner, a look of utter contempt flashing in their depths. They settled on Silas Croft, whose triumphant smile had curdled into a mask of wary disbelief. Finally, his gaze found Alara. She met his eyes, and for the first time that night, she didn't see a predator. She didn't see pity or lust. She saw something that felt like a cold, clear dawn after a long, terrible night. It was resolve. Hard, unyielding, and absolute. The room held its breath, waiting. The cowboy's hand rested near his hip, his fingers brushing almost casually against the well-worn handle of his Colt. The air was thick with unspoken threats, and the night was no longer about whiskey. The silence in the Last Hope Saloon was a physical thing, thick and heavy as the unswept dust on the floorboards. It clung to the men, choking the laughter in their throats and pinning them to their seats. Caleb's entrance hadn't just interrupted a transaction, it had fractured the sordid reality they had all built together. His presence was a judgment. Silas Croft, recovering from his initial shock, felt a surge of indignant fury. This was his town, his saloon, his rules. He straightened his waistcoat, a sneer twisting his lips. Well, look what the storm dragged in. You lost, friend. This is a private affair. Caleb's gaze, cold as a winter river, remained locked on Silas. He didn't look at the hulking trapper to his left or the twitchy farmhand to his right, both of whom had been Silas's most vocal supporters. He spoke, and his voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it carried to every corner of the room. It stopped being private when you put a price on a child. The word child hung in the air, a stark and ugly truth that no amount of whiskey could wash away. Alara flinched on her stool. He saw her not as property, not as a woman, but as a child. A sliver of warmth, fragile and foreign, pierced the ice of her terror. She's 17, Silas spat, as if the number made it honorable. And her father consented. A debt is being paid. It's got nothing to do with you. He gestured with his chin to a burly man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, a man named Jed. Jed here was about to finalize the deal. Weren't you Jed? Jed, emboldened by his boss's defiance, pushed his chair back and stood. He was a big man, built for brawling, not thinking. That's right, so why don't you just turn that big horse of yours around and ride on out before you get hurt? Caleb didn't even grant Jed a glance. His focus was a laser on Silas. Let the girl go. It wasn't a request. It was a final warning. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Or what? You gonna shoot us all? He spread his hands, showing his own holstered pistol. You're one man. With a subtle flick of his eyes, he signaled Jed and another crony by the bar. The room held its breath. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. This was it. The moment it would all erupt into blood and noise. The crony by the bar, quicker but more foolish than Jed, reached for his gun. He was fast, but Caleb was living in a different measure of time. Before the man's fingers could even close around the pistol grip, Caleb's left hand shot out, grabbing a half-empty whiskey bottle from the nearest table. In one fluid motion, he pivoted and smashed it against the side of the man's head. The crony crumpled with a choked gasp, a cascade of glass and amber liquid splashing onto the filthy floor. Jed roared and lunged, a bear of a man aiming to crush Caleb in his arms. But Caleb was no longer there. He sidestepped the clumsy charge, his boot catching Jed's ankle. The big man tumbled forward, his momentum carrying him headfirst into the very auction block where Alara sat. The wood cracked under the impact, and Jed lay groaning, dazed and out of the fight. It had taken less than 3 seconds. The entire saloon was frozen in stunned disbelief. Now it was just Caleb and Silas. Silas, his face pale with a mixture of rage and burgeoning fear, fumbled for his own weapon. He managed to pull the heavy Colt from its holster, but as he raised it, Caleb closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Caleb's hand clamped down on Silas's wrist, his grip like iron. The bones in Silas's arm screamed in protest. With a sharp, brutal twist, Caleb forced the gun from his hand. It clattered to the floor. Silas stared at his empty hand, then at the unwavering coldness in Caleb's eyes. The fight was over before he'd even understood it had begun. There was no glory here, no grand showdown, just the swift, efficient dismantling of his authority. "I said," Caleb repeated, his voice now a deadly whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "Let her go." He shoved Silas backward. The smaller man stumbled, tripping over Jed's prone form, and landed in a heap on the floor, humiliated and defeated. Caleb bent down and picked up Silas's gun, not with any sense of triumph, but with the weary motion of a man cleaning up a mess. He tucked it into his own belt. Then he scanned the faces of the other patrons. The avarice and cruel humor were gone, replaced by stark terror. Men who had been bidding on a human life moments before now couldn't meet his eyes, their gazes fixed on their drinks, the floor, anywhere else. The silence was broken by a quiet, wretched sob. It came from the corner where Alara's father sat, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Caleb's eyes found him, and the coldness returned, sharpened with a deep, cutting contempt. Caleb walked over, his boots echoing in the now cavernous silence. He stopped before the broken man. He didn't need to speak. His shadow was enough of a condemnation. Alara watched, her breath catching in her throat. She felt a lifetime of anger and betrayal bubble up inside her, a poison that had been slowly killing her. Caleb glanced from the father to Alara, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He was not her judge. He was her liberator. He was giving her the space to make her own verdict. Slowly, shakily, Alara slid off the stool. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to hold her. She walked past the wreckage of the fight, past the stunned onlookers, and stopped a few feet from her father. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "Alara, I didn't know what else to do." He was gonna. His words trailed off, empty and useless. There were no excuses that could fill the chasm he had opened between them. She looked at the man who was supposed to protect her, the man who had instead sold her for a few bottles of cheap whiskey. She saw not a monster, but something worse, a coward. A man so hollowed out by his own weakness that he had tried to feed his daughter to the wolves to save himself. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. All the fire of her rage had burned down to cold, hard ash. "There's nothing left to say," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. She turned her back on him, a simple act that felt like closing a tomb. She would not look at him again. Caleb gave a curt nod, as if accepting her decision. He walked to the bar, where the terrified bartender stood frozen. Caleb pointed to the dozens of bottles that had been laid out as payment. "This," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "is Silas Croft's bill. Take it out of whatever he owes you." He then turned to face the entire room. "This town is called Redemption's Bluff. I don't see any redemption here, just a bluff. Remember this night. Remember what you were about to do, and know that some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed." His gaze finally rested on Alara, and the hardness was gone, replaced by a quiet concern. "Miss," he said gently, "you're free. Is there a place I can take you? A parsonage in the next town? A family you know?" She looked around the saloon, at the leering faces now cowed, at the filth, at the ghost of her father. This place was a cage, and she had to fly from it or die. "Anywhere," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Anywhere but here." Caleb nodded once more. He led her toward the swinging doors, his presence a shield against the world. As they stepped outside, the oppressive rain had finally ceased. The air was cool and clean, washed new. In the east, the faintest hint of dawn was breaking through the heavy gray clouds, a promise of light. Caleb's horse stood patiently, a dark, solid shape in the gloom. Without a word, he cupped his hands for her. Alara placed her worn boot into his grasp and let him lift her onto the saddle. She sat in front of him, her back straight, refusing to lean against him, clutching the pommel as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. Caleb swung up behind her, taking the reins. They rode out of Redemption's Bluff at a steady walk, leaving the saloon and its sordid secrets behind. They didn't look back. The town grew smaller, a smudge of flickering lamplight in the vast, dark landscape of the plains. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on the damp earth. The rising sun began to paint the sky in strokes of pale pink and orange. It was the most beautiful sunrise Alara had ever seen. "My sister," Caleb said suddenly, his voice quiet behind her. "She was about your age. A man like Silas, he thought he owned her too." Alara didn't turn. She didn't need to see his face to understand the lifetime of pain and purpose in those few words. It wasn't just a principle for him. It was a promise he'd made to a ghost. "What happened to her?" Alara asked softly. "I was too late," he said. The words were simple, heavy, final. Alara felt a tear, hot and silent, slide down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness for herself, but of gratitude for him. He hadn't been too late for her. She reached up and wiped it away, her hands steady. Ahead of them, the trail stretched toward the horizon, a golden ribbon under the new sun. She didn't know Caleb's name. She didn't know where they were going. But as she felt the warmth of the morning on her face, for the first time since she could remember, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The future was a blank page, and for the first time, she felt she might be allowed to write on it herself.